The concepts and fundamental skills we need to know in order to work with any Excel worksheet still applies when working with multiple worksheets. We still add, edit, and delete content and cells the same way. We still format things the same way. And for the most part, we also still create calculations the same way. In this chapter, we want to take a few minutes to review a few worksheet basics, in case it's been a while since you've used them, or perhaps you've never really learned some of these basic skills. This is especially true if you've worked with versions of Excel up to and including 2003, because after that is when the big changes occurred in Excel 2007, 2010, and 2013 to date. There are 4 basic areas that we want to review. We want to review why linking data is important, what options you need to be aware of when working with more than one worksheet, how naming can be used to simplify and clarify data, and how grouping worksheets can optimize your work. It's impossible to have all the data you'll need stored in a single worksheet. Well, actually, let me rephrase that just a little bit. For very simple data, it might be both possible and logical. But for more complex data, you might be able to store it all in one worksheet. I never want to say never, but if you do, it would probably be a huge mass of data and therefore be very cumbersome stored in that way. We'll discuss a little bit more about the benefits of drawing from dispersed data in just a moment. But once you understand why linking to data from other worksheets and sources and locations is important, it then becomes important to understand how to extend the basic skills that you're familiar with, working on a single worksheet, so that you can effectively encompass multiple worksheets. This includes physically manipulating the numbers and the locations of worksheets within an Excel file, as well as customizing their properties to meet the needs of the data and the people using them. These additional skills will help make your work with Excel less frustrating and more effective. That is really one of the overriding benefits of working with and linking to data, and that is simplifying our work. To truly optimize the tasks that you attempt in Excel, you need to be able to streamline and simplify whenever possible. This includes not only the physical number of steps to complete tasks, but also the ability of both yourself and others to quickly and easily understand the data of which you're working. By far, one of the most underused features Excel provides that speaks to this important benefit is the use of names. By using names, references are easier to remember and easier to understand. This is important not only for you, but for others who may use your worksheets as well. You won't use them all the time, but you should be aware of how to create and use names when it's appropriate. As you work through the series, you'll see the more dispersed the data becomes, the more important naming becomes. The final concept for us to consider is based on an approach to life in general, I suppose, and it applies itself very well to Excel. It can be said in many ways like, don't reinvent the wheel, or we can do things the easy way, or we can do things the hard way. There's a lot of different sayings, but what we're referring to is that when we work through Excel, if we need to do similar things in multiple places, it's better if we only have to do them once and have it apply to all of those locations, instead of doing the same task over and over and over again. In this case, we're talking about being able to group worksheets. Most of us understand the time benefit of not repeating the same task more than once. In Excel, though, it's actually more important than just that. We all want to be efficient, but the critical part in Excel is that our information be accurate. If we have to do something more than once, the likelihood that we will make a mistake one or more of those times is greater. Similarly, when it comes to things like formatting, if we apply it to everything all at once, then we can be assured they're all exactly the same. These are the reasons why learning how to group worksheets is important. But let's get back to one of our core concepts of this entire series, and that is, why should we even link data? Well, one of my commandments of Excel usage, and there are only 5 of them, is thou shalt have 1 point of data entry. Why is that important? Actually, the answer is many reasons. First of all, a value is entered only once. And any time a value is entered only once, instead of over and over and over again, it's more efficient. Let's just say, for example, that your sales tax rate is 5%. You should only enter the sales tax rate of 5% one time, and then have everything that needs to use that tax rate refer back to that cell instead of entering it over and over again. That also means that things are going to be accurate. We don't have multiple chances to put in different values, or possibly to have errors. It's going to be not only accurate, but it's also going to be consistent. If it's only entered once, it can't be anything but consistent. That means it's also easier to update. If our sales tax rate changes, we go to one cell and change one number instead of possibly 10, hundreds, or even thousands of numbers, depending on the times that number is used within a worksheet or a workbook. In addition, it's going to reduce user confusion. There may be, for example, a single worksheet that has all of your standard numbers, like a tax rate or a markup. People can look at that one worksheet and very easily understand all of the math that's happening behind the scenes with the calculations in other worksheets. It also is going to conserve infrastructure. Now, that's kind of looking at the really big picture, but often in businesses especially, we see that the same data is entered over and over and over again. That means it's being stored over and over again. It's taking up disk space, it's taking up resources needing to be backed up, and all of those other things that go along with it. So we not only want to be efficient with our own time, but also with company resources. And that includes things that we often don't think about, like server space and IT personnel. Along those lines, I do also want to make sure that everybody understands we need to make sure our data is backed up. And if we have the same data in multiple places, all being used in separate ways, it means we have to make sure that all of those different sources are backed up. If we go back to the commandment and have our data in one place, one point of data entry, then we're only going to be backing up one file. If you work on your own or in a smaller business, it may be a little more difficult to see why all of this is important. But at this point, you just have to trust me. The more complex your data is, the bigger your data is, and the more places or sources your data comes from, the more important it is to actually link that data rather than repeating the data itself. Now let's switch gears a little bit and talk about naming in Excel. Naming is something that you can do anytime you use Excel. It's not limited to linking data or using multiple worksheets, but it's a really good habit to get into. If you're not familiar with naming, on the bottom right side of the screen, you can see an example of first, a calculation that does not use names, and secondly, a calculation that does. This will help you understand why naming is important. First of all, naming cells or ranges of cells makes it easier to remember. I can remember something called total revenue a lot easier than I can remember the range G1 through G67. It also makes it more meaningful. Again, total revenue is pretty self-explanatory. G1 through G67 is not. I would need to actually go look at that range and hopefully find a label to help me understand what that data actually is. Naming can be applied to individual cells, to ranges of cells, to tables, and to formulas. So really, names can be used throughout Excel. Again, whether you're linking data or working with multiple worksheets or not, naming is a really good, sound practice, and maybe a best practice for everybody to use. One of the things that has changed in the most recent versions of Excel is we now can have naming with scope. It used to be that a name had to be unique throughout the entire workbook or the entire Excel file, but scope can now be limited to a specific worksheet or the entire workbook, which gives us some options. Names are also absolute values, and you can kind of play around with that. We'll take a look at some of these options in some later videos, but by default, names refer to a specific cell or a specific range. The reason that's important is because it prevents issues when we move or copy the formulas and functions. They still work because they're absolute values, not relative references. So what are the requirements when you make a name? Well, they're pretty simple, and fortunately, Excel will tell us if we make an error. Basically, they need to be less than 255 characters. In other words, keep it short and sweet. They cannot contain spaces, and they should be alphanumeric. Underscores are allowed. For example, total underscore sales, but no other special characters are allowed, and they must begin with a letter. Another important thing is that they can't resemble a cell reference. For example, if you're talking about airplanes, you can't name something B-52 because B-52 is also a cell reference, the B column and the 52nd row. You can override internal or default names, but that really isn't recommended. Examples of some of the names that already exist that Excel uses are things like print area, print titles, consolidate area, and sheet title. The most important thing to remember is keep it short and sweet, but meaningful. And if you break some of the rules, like try to put a space, Excel will be happy to tell you, and you can fix it before you finish it up. Another thing that we can do to help simplify our work is grouping worksheets. I never want to be accused of being lazy, but we can work smarter rather than harder. When you need to do the same thing in the same location on more than one worksheet, we can group the worksheets and do it all in one step. Things like adding labels, creating calculations, and applying formatting are perfect examples of when you should consider grouping worksheets together. It simply allows us to perform the action once instead of multiple times. And kind of going with the theme that we've had through this entire video, that's going to save us time, and it's going to ensure consistency. I always like to give you a little hint, though, when I can, and that is if you're grouping worksheets, be sure to ungroup the worksheets before you go on to do other specific work. Otherwise, whatever you do for the specifics is going to apply to everything in the group. So to tie all of this together, we need to remember our goal. The goal is that using these features, when appropriate, not all the time, but when appropriate, as we link data from other locations, as well as when we're working between multiple worksheets, is going to assist us in meeting our core Excel goals. And that is that our work and our data are always clear, efficient, and accurate.